And even if you got a little bit too deep, we wouldn't be particularly offended, because we're part of the process and we know where it's coming from and we know how to interpret the feedback. So yeah, that would be my feedback on you. And I'm going to sign off because I think I have an electrician here for a minute. So I'm still going to be listening with half an ear and dealing with my electrician. Sorry.
Thank you. That was helpful background.
Hey, Matt, I had one thing to add. Potentially, I guess it would probably fit in your operations bucket. I think the outline you put together was right on the money. I think this came up maybe 2 calls ago. Perhaps it was the discussion where we were sort of jointly having a meeting with some of the parks folks as well. Somebody on the panel asked the question of who would actually own the facility once built. And, now that we have a potential out there for a private developer to develop part of a facility that we'd be in, I think ownership, is a big deal. And then sort of an ancillary discussion about that is, the tax liability of the site, because if it's a, privately owned for-profit entity, it's going to be taxable and it will have real property and other consequences. And if it's city owned, it won't. And if it's in something that's privately owned, but is also a city owned, it's one of these things where we need to consider that on probably in the operational bucket, because either expenses or revenue will be generated as a result of that decision. And, again, it was somebody else who brought it up a few meetings ago, but I thought it was a good point for us to consider in addition to the facilities folks.
Right. No, that's a good reminder, Brian, and something I'll add here under the operational budget. Dan, the city's thoughts on, I know you're still talking about 2 different sites, but as far as initial conversations about the ownership structure, has the city given that some thought? How are those conversations going with Continental, I guess, specifically on the Kingsdale site?
So I think all of our discussions with regard to Kingsdale have involved the city owning fee for the site on which the community center is built. And I have sent the legal question that, Brian, you just raised a moment ago with regard to taxability to the city attorney's office, and I'm waiting for a formal response back from them. But I did want to mention this sort of general concept, which I think we're all in agreement on, which is to the extent that the building is utilized for a community center, it should be non-taxable. To the extent that it has other private office space, even if the city owns it, it will be taxable. And we're going to have to obviously account for that, as you mentioned, in the operating budget, certainly in a lease structure, if we end up owning office space. But in every scenario that we're looking at, we would own the ground under which the community center is built and the community center facility itself. And if you step back a couple of meetings ago, part of the reasoning for that is it appears as though we've got the resources available to build this facility and the capital expenses associated with this facility through TIF and other mechanisms, obviously subject to the recommendations of this group. And to put an additional, rent into the operating expenses just doesn't seem like it would make a whole lot of sense, given that we're not struggling to meet the capital financing needs.
So that's helpful. That's helpful, Dan. And maybe if you can circulate once the city attorney's office kind of confirms that, that'd be helpful. Brian, does that address your question or?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, one of the things that always comes up when you're talking about public facilities that are sort of commingled with private ones is making sure that the folks that are in the private space know that they are not exempt from, whatever they're up to. And I think Dan makes a very good point of, if we have an office or a coffee shop or anything like that that's privately run, that would just be part of the lease arrangement that we would have, where we would expect them to cover the necessary and appropriate expenses. But it's also one of those things, I think, when we are looking at this, it would not have jumped to my mind initially that there would have been that circumstance, because I think or at least I don't want to speak for everyone else, I've been thinking about this as a wholly owned public facility. And with what we're talking about with partnerships and other things, and potentially with this development at Kingsdale, it will definitely be a mixture of public and privately owned space. So that's just something we need to factor in. That's a helpful answer, Dan. I'm glad that the legal folks are looking at that.
So if folks have, this was really just my first stab at, listening to some reflections of this group on narrowing down some of the issues under capital, operational, and partnership buckets that, I think there's, as Todd said at the outset, there's a lot of different ways we could go, a lot of different roads you could go down on evaluating these structures. This was an attempt to kind of capture some of the reoccurring themes I think we've heard to date. This list is admittedly pretty fluid, although I think we're getting to that point where I'd like to firm it up, and so that we all, we can know where we need to dig a little deeper, what further tasks we need to answer these questions with clarity. So if there are other suggestions, whether they be here or, in between now and the next meeting 2 weeks from today, I'd love to hear them, and maybe I think with the goal of really walking into that, the meeting 2 weeks from today with a concrete kind of set of objectives under each of these three buckets to narrow in on. But Linda or Brian or Todd, did you have other items that you think really need to be addressed under these buckets, or some that maybe aren't appropriate that you don't think are appropriate for us to delve into? I think that's certainly a possibility as well.
I think one thing, Matt, and this may be way off base, I don't know, but the third item under the capital stack, the statement of regarding raising property taxes to fund construction costs, should that be a statement under operating as well?
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think yes. I'm interested, Brian, Todd, what are your thoughts on that? But it feels like that's a question that's going to come up both in the capital side and in the operational side, Linda.
Yeah.
I think Linda's right.
Yeah. I think we need to be very clear from the outset about property tax visions.
I agree on the clarity point. I also, I thought Steve helped clarify and provide good perspective, particularly with the task force and the intent of where we're going and a recommendation. So I do want to take another look at it, Matt, in that light, and I'll just send you comments here in the next day or so.
Okay, great.
Let me throw one thing out to the group that came up in some of our conversations, actually with Westerville specifically. And one of the principles by which they operate their facility is that they treat all taxpayers the same, rather than focusing on residents. So the folks who work in our city pay taxes in our city. And so they have a model that treats residents and employees in the same way. I don't know if that's something this group wants to take a look at from an economic development perspective. We think that's probably pretty important, and a way to really use this as a driver of economic development in the community to say to employers that your employees will be treated treated in terms of membership expenses and those kinds of things as though they're residents. And that's, something we do with a lot of our programming already. So I don't know if that rises to the level, Matt, of kind of the principles that you guys are talking about now, but I do want to, kind of listening to the conversation, I wanted to throw that out there as an idea that we heard from Westerville that I think is has a lot of appeal to us.
And is consistent with how we are currently pricing other recreation programs.
Correct. Membership at pools and tennis are live or work in UA.
So they, just to make it very clear, they get resident rates.
That is correct. If you live or work within the city limits.
Yeah, I think that
Which
that's a
of those
great
three is the-
observation, Steve. That
What-
third bullet point there under operating, where we're kind of digging into this, that feels like a natural home for it, where we're looking at resident rates, but also non-resident rates, whether they're an employee of the city. Debbie, it may be helpful just, kind of circling back to that initial comment about what would be a little bit of the homework we should do to really feel educated about that issue. If the city, I don't know if they track this, but if they can provide any information on non-resident employees that are taking advantage of city services, whether that's the pool or other services that are structured with that type of payment structure.
Yes, in our recreation registration system, we do track residency, and we can track it by if it's address or employment. So we can get an idea of that, what that number is.
That's great.
Sure.
Okay.
Do that for you.
Well, I want to be sensitive to our time and keep us on schedule here, but Dan and Debbie have done a lot of research on partnerships and what they're seeing as in adjacent communities with regard to their partnership models. So I want to leave out some time there for that presentation and then reflections from the group on it. So Dan, I'll hand it to you and look forward to hearing your feedback here.
All right, so for this group, this is probably the 101, 201 overview of things, but wanted to sort of frame a discussion for all of you with regard to partnership models that are in existence around Central Ohio and the state of Ohio. And so really relying on you to sort of see where you want to go from here afterwards, but we wanted to go through a couple of different models that we've seen in play in our discussions with other recreation facilities and other potential operators. Can all of you see the screen? Good. All right, I'm going to put this into presenter mode here. So there are really three different options for partnerships: the capital partner, operating partner, and the leasehold partner relationship that we're seeing out there. And of these, the capital partnership is really the least common. The only example that we can find in recent years is in Mason, Ohio, which is a great facility for all of you to potentially look at for a variety of different reasons. And I think Jeff Anderson is working on potentially setting up a tour of this facility for you to take a look at. A very innovative, I would also say unique facility in terms of its structure. The Mason facility is built on land that was owned by the city, but is directly abutting a school facility and was essentially constructed or paid for by the school district and then leased back to the city for $1 a year. The school district has first rights to an extensive portion of that facility, and a very unique relationship between the school district and the city in that area. I would note in our conversations, and Debbie, I don't know if you have other details to this that you wanted to include, but there were not existing fitness facilities in Mason when their center was originally constructed. And they were also, and I'll get to this in a minute, able to, in a later expansion, essentially look at also a leasehold partnership that was pretty innovative. Two things I just wanted to note about capital partnership, despite their sort of rarity around. Obviously, there's a interest from the UA Community Foundation to potentially do private fundraising, which in some ways fits into this, much like a capital partnership. And then the school district itself, in our preliminary discussions, is about TIF, is really potentially a partnership, a relationship there through their willingness to allow us to use a TIF proceeds for the construction of this facility. So even without the absence of a relationship like Mason has, I just wanted to sort of remind everyone that TIF agreement itself looks a whole lot like a capital partnership between the city and the school district. And I don't want to understate that in any way. There are also a couple of different models for operating partnerships, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but really the two models that exist in Central Ohio are either a YMCA model where municipalities have tended to construct the facilities and then they enter an agreement with the YMCA to operate that fitness facility. And then the other very innovative project in Central Ohio is in New Albany at the Heit Center, where I'll talk about this in just a minute, but it's operated by Ohio State, and then Ohio State has a third-party agreement with a firm to operate the fitness component of that facility. So if you look at not just Delaware and Reynoldsburg, but also Whitehall and other communities around that have constructed YMCAs in recent years, each of these was paid for by the municipality in one way, shape, or form. And then they've entered into an agreement with the YMCA to operate that facility. I would note that there are sort of confines or limits to the range of services that the YMCA will contract for. So for example, they will not contract for providing senior center services, as we're contemplating in Upper Arlington. And the Y, I think, sort of unapologetically in our conversations talks about the fact that they are not tax supported. So everything they do needs to have a cost recovery element to it. In fact, not just an element, but typically full cost recovery. There are things that the Y does very, very well. Fitness is among them. I think also childcare tends to be a real strength of the YMCA. But some of the non-fitness programming that we currently offer doesn't fit squarely within the typical model for a YMCA. And I guess I want to just pause here for a minute and have Debbie, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that enrichment programming that we offer that wouldn't necessarily fit within what the YMCA typically offers.
Sure, thank you, Dan. So some of the enrichment programs that we offer would be considered both enrichment or lifelong learning. So within that, on a youth level, those would be programs such as STEM learning or youth ballet classes, music, child enrichment, like babysitting type of classes. When you get into the adult, we offer many classes within teaching languages, creative writing, cooking, nutrition type of programs, musical instruments. And then as we get into seniors, we even get into more of lectures, current history type of classes, many types of dancing that are not necessarily your exercise aerobic type of classes, but line dancing, ballroom dancing, luncheons, a variety of for senior aging type of balance and reflexology type classes. So they're more than your normal traditional just fitness and recreation programs that take place in a variety of types of rooms based on the type of program that's offered. So, thank you.
The other operating model, as I mentioned, is in New Albany at the Heit Center. And this is a pretty innovative partnership between not just Ohio State, but also Nationwide Children's as a leaseholder in that facility for clinical space, and also Healthy New Albany, a nonprofit that really spearheaded the construction of the facility. This facility, probably similar to some of the things we've talked about, utilized TIF proceeds from the beauty park over in New Albany to construct the facility itself. They then entered into an agreement with Ohio State, not just for clinical space, but physical therapy space on the second floor. And then Ohio State, as part of that agreement, actually is obligated to operate the fitness facility, which is on the first floor. It's a little bit more limited in its scope compared to what we've contemplated here in Upper Arlington. No gym, for example, much more modest aquatics. not a whole lot of programming that's oriented toward children. But as a result, Ohio State has now contracted with a third party, IWP out of Akron, to operate that fitness component. And they do so in a way that is pretty seamless, at least visually, within the facility itself. That is, the IWP employees are wearing shirts that identify them as part of the Heit Center. It's not obvious that they're actually third-party employees. And they have a pretty elaborate sort of tracking and basic analysis of health standards for each of the members at that facility. That is, when you exercise on a piece of Nautilus equipment there, it actually, you have a key fob. It's tied to a recording system, and so they can kind of monitor what you've done in terms of exercising. And then you periodically have the ability to meet with a professional to talk about your goals and sort of health and wellness goals. This is a pretty interesting scenario in terms of the operations. And, Leon, I think we'll talk about this at our next meeting, but there are two things that they've mentioned in their discussions to us where this has come into play in terms of the contractual relationship with IWP. The first was at the startup of this facility, where you typically don't have your membership fully built out. The shortfall in revenue, because Ohio State was the contractual entity that entered into the contract with IWP, fell on Ohio State in those early years until the membership, I think in the third year, fully got up to levels that they anticipated in their model. Then the second thing is something that's impacting a lot of community centers now and YMCAs right now, which is a lot of people are not attending those facilities and either somehow escrowing those memberships or deferring them. And that shortfall in revenue is one that Ohio State is feeling, not necessarily the city of New Albany. The other partnership model is this leasehold partnership. And this seems to be the most common that we're seeing, and it takes on a couple of different forms. Again, the Mason, Ohio facility is a pretty innovative one, not just for its original construction model with the school district, but they then went back after actually some difficulties in revenues and entered into a partnership with a health provider to lease space in an expansion that they did. And that expansion was essentially funded through the lease with the medical provider. And then they have an additional $200,000 approximately on an annual basis that's in excess that helps subsidize the operation of their facility. So not only are they able to pay for the debt of that expansion space, but also effectively got some subsidy for their operating. And that operating space was important to them from a couple of different reasons. One, again, given its location, they didn't have enough clinical medical space in their community. And so that was seen as a real bonus for them. And then, as you'll hear in the Reynoldsburg example as well, the little bit of income tax is also something that some communities see as important through having additional office space. The Reynoldsburg model, which was just completed early this year, I think they opened just before COVID hit, involves a partnership with Ohio Health for the leasing of about 10,000 square feet in that YMCA. And Reynoldsburg, in our discussions with them, talked about the importance of that relationship, again, in terms of access for medical services and income tax generation in their community. But the lease is structured in a way that it's covering the cost of that physical space and the debt associated with that. And then obviously helping to spread some of the CAM charges around just a little bit between the YMCA and Ohio Health. One thing we did want to just remind the subcommittee, I think we've mentioned this before, but there is a limitation in terms of partnerships at the Kingsdale location, at least as it applies to medical providers. When the city entered into an agreement with Ohio State for the Zollinger Road building, that agreement included restrictions on the city incentivizing additional projects within the Kingsdale Triangle that would have medical services in it that would compete with what's offered in the Zollinger Road facility. So it doesn't exclude everything, but it does limit the types of partnerships that can occur if Kingsdale is selected as that location.
Hey, Dan, is it possible for us to get just greater clarity on what would be in and out at some point?
Absolutely. Yeah. We essentially have to ask Ohio State all of the services that are being offered in the Zollinger Road facility. And then it's, you know, navigating that to find which things wouldn't compete, obviously.
Yeah. And is there I mean, presumably we could do it incrementally, right? With just understanding based on what they're advertising and et cetera, or at least frame it up from a high level before we potentially go down that route. But just curious, is it, you know, physical? Well, I'm not sure what they're doing over there. So is like physical therapy, is rehabilitation, you know, some of the things that are more natural in this facility already being done there, or is that, you know, a surgery center and you know, primary care doctors at just high level?
Sure, be happy to provide that. So just in summary, from our sort of review of what's going on in Ohio, the leasehold partnership option looks like the most likely, given what's going on in recent facilities. This typically is in terms of complementary services. As you were mentioning, Todd, a minute ago, physical therapy is often a component of these partnerships. And when it's done well, can provide an additional operating revenue subsidy for the community center facility itself. That Mason, Ohio example is one that stands out, I think, because, you know, that $200,000 annually is pretty significant in terms of closing a gap between where cost recovery occurs and membership rates. The other piece of it is that the operating partnerships, we feel, need to allow for existing leisure programming that the city already offers, and obviously needs to include operations of our senior center programs and services as well. And so the form of that partnership, the operating partnership, may impact the goals that the task force is looking at for a community center. And sort of the form of question is, you know, what does a community center look like to all of you? And, you know, I think we heard some comments from the broader task force at the last meeting about including non-fitness activities and space into that facility. And the operating partnership has a real impact on that arrangement and what the community center looks like. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Dan. That's a really helpful overview. I just had one question. You know, you mentioned the YMCA and IWP as operating partners and the Ohio State University. Are you seeing other third-party operators of substance in this space? I mean, is it the Y and OSU that have kind of dominated the Central Ohio marketplace, or are there other operators out there that may have a more expansive line of services than potentially the Y has right now?
Those are really the two.
Okay.
Ohio Health obviously has their own facility that they're operating down close to Riverside, but those are the two.
Yeah, and Mount Carmel runs one up in Orange Township, but it's right next to one of their hospitals.
Okay.
On the recreation side, it's more of your outdoor facilities that may have different partners, but for the community center, just those that have been listed.
Okay.
What about, have you seen naming sponsorships, and is that something that the city would consider?
I don't know if Steve, do you want to answer?
Yes and yes. So we do have Debbie and Dan and the team before I got here had put together a naming policy coming out of some of the other projects we've done in our parks. So we do have a naming policy there. So yes, there is an opportunity when we get into the fundraising standpoint to say, you know, the Pereira family kitchen will certainly will be happy to put that on there for a more than nominal fee. So yeah, we'll have those opportunities. And I think it's a great, and look, it's a great way to get folks who are vested in the community to invest in the facility. And I think as from the, you know, I'm filling kind of Dan's role along with Jeff with the facilities committee. And I think, you know, they look at that as an opportunity to, I won't go from good to great, I'll go from great to awesome. You know, find ways to take this facility from great to awesome and look at, you know, some of those spaces where we can do really good programming and find some things to really enhance that.
And Steve, is the naming policy sort of limited to the kind of philanthropic donation, or does it apply to like potentially corporate partnerships? You know, you see that like Nationwide Children sometimes pays to put its name on, which is an advertising component to them, but obviously, you know, in a place where they're trying to, you know, build their name.
Debbie, I can't remember whether the policy officially addresses that or not.
It is open to both. It's ultimately with council's approval, but it allows for both.
Okay, that's helpful.
So I have a couple of things. For the YMCA, is it possible to collaborate with them and turn this into kind of a hybrid approach where, you know, they are the partner that provides the, you know, the specialties, what they normally do, and we, the city, provide everything else in one facility? Can't that be could that be a possibility?
Not sure who wants to answer that question.
I'll take it. In a bigger facility, yeah. So our problem is our facility is so tight that, you know, that works well if you can draw really clear lines. I think this is what we've learned from talking to them. And listen, I will be honest with you. I'm a big Y booster, was a longtime member. Tony Collins and I went through some battles together when we were both in the city of Columbus, and is a good professional friend. But, you know, there are some things about their model that it works better if you can have clear lines of demarcation as to what's Y space and what's city space. And I don't think we're going to have that option with the way this facility is going to be laid out and constructed. We don't, you know, we're not going to be able to grow physically. So we got to be really efficient and flexible in terms of how we use our space.
Perfect. Great insight. Thank you. The other thing I wanted to mention is the Heit Center. And I'm sure you have talked with them and gotten all kinds of details, but I will say I was pretty involved out there from 2016 through 2019. And I think there was a lot of angst about the success of that center. So I just want to mention it.
Yeah, when I was listening to the presentation, I was thinking, my guess is that Ohio State probably learned a couple lessons from taking responsibility for a couple of those points of loss. Yeah. And I don't know that we would get the same deal.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, and I don't know how much, I don't remember how much we've delved into it, but I think a lot of their struggle came from the fact that they, in their demographics, they had so many people who already belonged to the country club, et cetera. And they just weren't seeing that crossover or duplication. There may have been other reasons, but.
This is my ignorance, Steve, but on the Y, when they step in as the operator, are they also in essentially the guarantor of break-even operations? I mean, if it operates at a deficit, operationally, does the Y cover that deficit, or how is that typically structured?
Dan and Debbie, do you guys want to answer that?
Yeah, it's typically structured that the Y is responsible for that operating budget. But in our discussions, they did, you know, I think in a moment of candor, talk about the realities that many organizations face when they have an economic downturn like they're in right now. They're not doing capital maintenance on those facilities. And so that becomes a concern when you're leasing the facility to a third party, obviously.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and rightfully so, as an operator, they would have all of the member service facilities. So gymnasium, workout facilities, exercise classrooms, swimming pool. And with that, they would allow time for members for access, as well as programs. And they need, just as Leon mentioned, you have to have a good mix of membership and program revenue to cover your costs. So with that, then what would be left for this? So that could potentially operate whole. What's left is the rest of the building that somebody's operating. That's the senior center. It's the area where it becomes more community centric, and it's where our department would have opportunity for some programs, but we would not be able to have. Why would you have exclusive or at least definitely prime time in those other areas that they would operate? So a lot of the programs we currently offer would not be able to be housed in this facility. And that's the bold reality is, if you have an operator such as that, many of our programs that we currently offer our community would not happen in this new facility.
That's helpful, Debbie, and some good insight. I guess what I think drawing some clarity on, so maybe I'll restate it as I understand it, and if I'm wrong, let me know, is that when the Y steps in, they serve as a third-party operator. Mm-hmm. If there are operational deficits year over year, that falls back on the owner, in this case being the city, to make up those funding shortfalls. I guess what I'm trying to delineate in my head is this is a partnership where someone else is taking on the potential losses, or is this really a third-party vendor relationship where, for instance, if we property manage a third-party property and there's a deficit at the end of the year because of a capital need or because of an occupancy issue or here a membership dip, we're going back to that owner and saying, there's a deficit. We were just your third-party manager, but there's a deficit here. Here's how much money we need. Is that how the Y operates? I'm just not familiar with their operational model.
No, I don't believe that that's how they're operating in Central Ohio. That they're operating that entire facility, and if there's a deficit in a given year, like there will be this year at many of their facilities, because memberships are down, that's on the Y.
That's on the Y. Okay. And then are those typically a long-term contractual relationship, Dan? Or is this a 3-year? Because obviously the Y, if they're operating at a deficit for a certain period of time, I'm sure they'd like to step out. So what's the typical term of one of these relationships that you've seen?
I can't remember the Delaware one. The Reynoldsburg is, I believe, a 20-year with a couple of 5-year options. Okay. Steve, you were going to say something. I apologize.
No, that's okay. So yeah, I mean, Matt, the fundamental point is they absorb a lot of risk, and that's the advantage of it.
Yeah.
And I think to add to that, that's for the portion of the facility that they would operate, that
right.
There's still another portion of the facility to cover costs.
Okay. Yeah. That's helpful. Thanks. Just ignorant on how they typically step in. Linda, did that address all your questions, or did you have other?
No, that's good.
Brian or Todd, did you have any other thoughts or questions on the?
Not on this point.
Nope.
Oh, Matt, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if this is the right time to bring it up, but the possibility of, I don't know that it's a partnership, but a collaboration with neighbors. Originally thought of Grandview and Marble Cliff, but maybe it's by zip code or something other than that, so that they become, a collaborating partner somehow with some, friendly membership rate as opposed to, the resident rate. And maybe, when we say that we're looking at 100,000 square feet, we're looking at that number because of our demographics, I would assume, right? Plus our space that we have to work with. And maybe adding, a population that many potential additional members doesn't fit either. Like you were saying, there's stoppers like there is with the Y. Any room for discussion about that?
Yeah, Debbie or Dan, did you see other centers operated with membership agreements with adjacent jurisdictions?
The experience I have is that would come from joint recreation districts where a few municipalities would join in create their own separate entity that would then operate a facility in partnership with a share to each of their own respective entities. Another example I have seen is where one agency may pay a fee to the other agency for their residents to be considered resident and get the resident rate. So those are the two examples I'm familiar with.
And the joint recreation district model was one that was explored by Upper Arlington the last time a community center was discussed. So the benefit of that is that all of the entities that join that joint recreation district, the taxing authority, if you're utilizing a property tax, extends to the entire geography and all of those jurisdictions. In Upper Arlington's case, it was really just a mechanism to sort of true up the boundaries. We're almost exactly on the same boundaries in the school district as the city, but there are a couple of minor differences. And it was just an effort to kind of true up those boundaries. It wasn't involving another jurisdiction per se, other than the school district.
And then also with Leon on the call, he may know of other examples of how municipalities may have partnered or jurisdictions. Not to put you on a spot, Leon.
Sorry. Well, I think the biggest ones that people are partnering with is where two municipalities get together and they both have a need and neither one of them are large enough to support it. So they'll do a partnership together, or a school district and a city will do a project together where the school district needed space, primarily field house space. And then the park district or the city works jointly together. And there are a lot of school district city models, not necessarily in Ohio, but around the country where they're jointly developed.
And Linda, I guess what I would say is also, we can kind of get that from a de facto standpoint if we allow non-residents to buy memberships at a premium rate.
Yeah.
And so, from a kind of capital standpoint, if we can cover the capital to get it built, and we look at it from either an operating standpoint or, one of the things we've talked about internally is saying, we'll take the premium, we'll take the markup on non-resident, call it non-taxpayers, back to my earlier comment. We'll take that markup and put that markup into our capital maintenance fund. I think that's one of the things that you can look at, kind of achieving the same benefits without going through the brain damage of coming up with all those other agreements.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say too that there's nothing that would prohibit, if membership and or program utilization isn't what was pro forma, there'd be nothing that would prohibit the city from, in latter years, pivoting and expanding, or tweaking their membership fee structure to bring in a broader constituency.
Yeah, I think the joint recreation model is a cool model. In Ohio, there's only 6 agencies that are set up that way. But certainly you would have, when we were doing the master plan, we also looked at people outside of Upper Arlington who actually had need for sports fields as well as needs for community center space that could be an option.
Yeah.
But I guess one of my questions is it an option if on day one we're building a 100,000 square foot facility? It's right sized for our population, I assume. Question.
And I'll be honest, I'll be honest with you. That's one of the other hesitations in terms of entering into something now. I think getting into it, making sure, figuring out whether we've got it right sized, and to Matt's point and Leon's point, there's nothing that prevents us in the future from adjusting how we do it to bring more body. If we find we've got excess space, great. If we find that we're bursting at the seams, maybe we wait to bring in another jurisdiction when there's some kind of an expansion opportunity at some point.
Great. Thanks for the conversation.
So I guess one question, I know we're running up against time, but one question I was thinking through on the lease, it feels like I'm sure there's many different options, but two clear options on the leasehold space in this particular facility. If it does land at the Kingsdale site, that additional 2 floors that folks are talking about, it's either the city pays for, I'm just reflective here, if the city either pays for the build out and finds a tenant, or would the secondary option be the city pays for someone else to incur those capital costs, own it, and find a tenant? Or is there an in-between that I'm missing? Or don't build it, I guess, could be a third option, but that feels like a oasis, some vertical air rights.
Yeah.
So
Dan and I are smiling because we've been round and round internally about this. So initially, when we had talked with Continental, we actually had proposed either a condoing of the building or an air rights lease or something like that to have them own the top 2 floors. The more we got into it, the more we became convinced that the added complexity of that was not that there was a ton of added complexity, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a building construction standpoint. We're really convinced, even post-COVID, that space is going to be fantastic. And if you'll give me 2 seconds, I know we're up against it on time, but to run through my standard spiel, which is, office going forward is going to be about amenities. Businesses and organizations have to convince their employees to come to work. They're not just going to be telling them to come to work. And so it's going to be about amenity-rich environments. And, you've got 12 restaurants within walking distance of a grocery store. Actually, Aldi has submitted for the Barnes & Noble space to put a grocery. So 2 grocery stores, 2 pharmacies, what am I missing? Oh yeah, and 100,000 square foot community center that has meeting rooms, and you've got 365-degree views all the way to downtown OSU and Northwest Columbus. I think that space is going to lease pretty easy. So, I internally was the biggest skeptic of whether or not we should own that office space, but I have increasingly become convinced that it is the right thing to do operationally and financially for the city.
And I would just add that that office space, I think, also addresses one of the other questions that circulated with regard to future expansion space of a facility. And I maybe didn't say it directly enough, but essentially the leaseholder agreement in a way becomes sort of a back door to a capital partner, because after year 10 or after year 20, whenever that arrangement is complete, the initial lease is complete, that space is available for the municipality and is typically fully paid off at that time. So you don't have to go through the capital expense in year 20, let's say, for an expansion of a facility, if that's the need that lives in that year.
Hey, Matt, I got a drop for a 1 o'clock. Sorry that I have to be on. So I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, we're going to wrap up. Thanks, Todd. Before we do wrap, I know in 2 weeks, we're going to go back into the operational budget with Leon and his team. So if there are specific items that you'd like pros to address, please let myself know, and I'll, circulate those comments to Dan, the city staff, and the team at pros. So want to put that out in front of folks. And then just before we adjourn, I know we've got a few folks on. I see Diane and Bill are still hanging on there. Anyone else from the committee that may be on that has questions or comments. Just want to pause before we wrap up, give you an opportunity.
This is Bill. It's fascinating listening to you. I'm thankful that y'all have taken on the partnership instead of the facilities committee. It's obviously y'all are better qualified to deal with it. So thanks for the good work. And oh, by the way, Steve, I agree with you 100% on the analysis of the ownership of the building.
Thanks.
Right on point. And that's all I got. Enjoyed listening.
Thanks, Bill.
Yep, and thank you from me too. I figure if I listen 5 times, I might figure it all out. So it was a
Fair enough.
Good meeting.
This is Linda Malakis.
Oh, hi, Linda.
I will add my thanks to it. I think this helps me, in terms of what we're doing and looking at the whole process. I think the takeaway for me is obviously we're very focused on the Kingsdale piece and not the municipal piece. Curious at what point we begin to negotiate with Continental for the purchase of that land and how that cost impacts what we do. So in that sense, what Steve and Dan are saying is that it makes sense to have ownership of the offices on the top of the building, because that maybe is what you're looking at to offset it. I think the surprise for me was the Heit Center up in New Albany, where you think the tax base is so phenomenal that they would have the concerns they had and how they had to approach that. And then the final thing is, it seems to me that Ohio State would be the optimum partner, because we would not be stepping on the agreements we already have in place with the building on Zollinger. So, but yeah, I agree completely with Bill. My God, this is mind-boggling, and obviously thank you, city people, since I'm being so generous, because you've done more work than I think we could ever dream of in this process. So thank you, all of you. And thanks for letting me listen in.
So to Linda's question about where are we on, we are in negotiations with them on the property. Long and the short of it is the transfer of the property will be wrapped up into the TIF agreement.
Contingent upon, the results of this task force work and a potential ballot issue.
Yes. Thank you, Dan.
Will it have an impact on the scope of what we're building, or the plans for what we're building for the community center, if we indeed have to purchase that? I mean, will that, I guess I don't have enough knowledge about it, but we'll be looking at absorbing that and keeping the program the same, whether it was built there or built at the municipal building. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm kind of fishing it around in my own head.
I think
go ahead,
Steve.
Go ahead, Dan. If I understand your question right, so the way that Nan and the team at Williams have set the 2 options up is that the program of community center operations is the same in both facilities. We have some additional, not a ton of additional, but some additional flexibility at the MSC site, but it comes with additional costs. Interestingly, the TIF, if the community center goes to the MSC site, the TIF will generate additional revenues, back to kind of Brian's earlier question, because you got more private use. You got basically another 100,000 square feet of volume that is private taxable use that can be captured by the TIF. Our, back of the placemat, because we're a little bit bigger than back of the envelope at this point, is that that's not going to be enough to cover the additional cost of having to tear down municipal building and rebuild very modest offices for the city staff, and parking and all that. So that's the complexities that we're getting into, and that's what we're going to get some help with Williams in terms of really scoping out what that delta is on the cost, and we can compare that to what the delta is on the revenue from the TIF. Did that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
And Steve, because of the extent of that TIF, it requires the approval of the school board. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this was really helpful. Thanks for staying over a few minutes. We will meet in 2 weeks. And again, I just like to encourage folks, if you do have specific questions, we've got a great, not only staff, Debbie and Dan, for all your work and homework on the partnership you're seeing in adjacent communities. That's really helpful framework. But if folks have questions that either the city staff and or our consultants can address in the next few weeks, feel free to send those over, and I think it'll help focus in our discussion here in a few weeks. So can I get a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Linda. I'll second. And we are adjourned. Thank you for everyone for joining. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Talk soon.